From Longwood in Boston, this is The Pulse, a Harvard Biotech Club podcast. I'm Yosef.
I'm Fang. Welcome to The Pulse, a deep dive into biotech stories, feature next-generation biotech leaders.
Okay, today we are so happy to have Madalyn Won on the show. Maddie is an alumni of the Harvard Biotech Club. She first served as director of the biotech incubator and later as president of the club. She did her PhD research in Barbara Burleigh's lab at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. After graduation, Madalyn joined McKinsey as an associate. We can't wait to dive into her story and hear her unique perspectives about her transition. Welcome to The Pulse, Maddie.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here with you guys and excited to chat.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be featured on this podcast. So we're wondering, for people that are listening to podcasts that might not know a lot about you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, where are you from and what's your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So long before graduate school, I was raised in Nebraska, in a very small town, but did my undergraduate degree also in Nebraska at a state college called the University of Nebraska at Omaha. There I studied biology and started working on parasites. That took me into my master's degree also at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, where I really developed a passion for the work, and decided to pursue a PhD. And so, upon that decision, I sort of came to Harvard, also to work on parasites. So during my PhD, I worked on a parasite called Trypanosoma cruzi. But early on, I knew that I probably wasn't going to be super, into the academic world and wanted to sort of branch out and learn more about industry. And that's when I got involved in the Harvard Biotech Club and really got into all the different initiatives and eventually, became president of the organization before moving on after graduate school.
Maddie, we saw you a TED Talk. That's happened in your college or happened in graduate school? It's college, right?
Actually, it was my master's degree. So it was also at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. It's a TEDx talk I gave.
Yeah,
you guys are
awesome.
doing the research. I see. It was on toxoplasmosis. So I studied a parasite at the time called Toxoplasma gondii. And so we talked about the importance of undergraduate research and a little bit about how the parasite works and all the different work going on in that area.
Yeah, I think you already had our answer for next questions. But I still want to dig into deeper about your motivation for pursuing a PhD. It's really challenging for you back then, or it's tedious? I know for some people. How about you?
The $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
No, I did my PhD because I thought to myself that this was a really great opportunity for me to get deeper into something I love doing. And for me, it was, right? So I did study parasites, which again, very niche area. So not everybody is really working on that at Harvard. But, I really enjoyed my master's degree and learning a ton about the scientific world for the very first time. And doing my PhD, yes, after 6 years, it gets a little tedious, but I did feel like I learned a ton, met a lot of really great people and really fulfilled a goal of mine to sort of spend a lot of dedicated time on a specific project.
That's really great to hear. I think a lot of us are really passionate about research, and that's why we decided to pursue a PhD to focus on research. And getting a PhD is really helpful to develop as a scientist while learning more about academic research before making the jump to industry. So I know you mentioned you had an idea you wanted to go into industry while in grad school, and that led you to join the Biotech Club. So I was wondering, since you had that idea initially, did being a part of the club, from leading the incubator and then becoming the president, have an impact on your career interest after grad school?
Yeah. So I would say I did come to grad school knowing that I probably didn't want to stay in academic research. But at the same time, there aren't a ton of industry opportunities in Omaha, Nebraska. So this also opened a ton of doors for me to come over to a coastal city, learn a ton about industry. And a huge draw for me when I joined Harvard was the Harvard Biotech Club. So I had heard about it, read some pamphlet somewhere, and I was like, oh, this is the club for me. So really from day one, I was wanting to be involved there. And from I don't know, probably the first 15 days of school, I started attending events with the biotech club. Really starting with like the 101 series, very simple things. And I would say my involvement with the biotech club has like entirely shaped my career path plans. Um, and the first piece around the incubator, I learned a lot about, how companies work, how you actually do the funding mechanisms, different things like that. And that really drove my interest in business development, which is a function at a pharma company where you help the pharma companies to sort of understand, based on their strategic needs, which companies, which technologies, which academic partners would be best to form partnerships with or to acquire technology from in order to further their own drug development, right? And so during that time, during grad school, I did an internship with BioMarin in business development. And that was super fun for me. I spent 3 months there full time. And then I worked part time for them for the next 9 months. And that was super formative in terms of deciding what I wanted to do long term. So at the time, I was also president of our biotech club, exploring lots of different careers, talking to different people every day. And what I was finding out is I really like everything, which is a problem when you're trying to choose a career path. And so consulting was a good solution for me because you get so much exposure to different types of careers, at different types of jobs, at different types of projects, that you have the opportunity to sort of, survey the world of pharmaceutical business practices, and then decide what you want to do. And maybe that'll be consulting, or maybe eventually I'll exit into pharma, into one of these functions. But for now, I'm very happy in this decision.
Yeah, and I know currently we are talking about you're talking about consulting. So you're working at McKinsey. So yeah, what do you think? What were the biggest challenges you faced during your transition out of PhD, and how do you overcome them? I think you just mentioned that's very intense. You joined the internship, you also like graduating. So how did you manage that?
Yeah, it was a really intense time. So my last year of grad school, essentially, I finished up this internship. I was starting to study for the interviews for consulting because as you guys know, there's a case interview component, right? Which PhDs are not naturally inclined to do. So you sort of have to do a little bit of studying, a little bit of thinking about these things in advance. And for me, that was a lot of hours, a lot of stress, trying to find the job. But the nice thing is you sort of apply for these jobs 9 months in advance. And so you're sort of set once you have that offer to focus on your PhD and finishing it. So that was very lucky for me. I received the offer and was able to really go focus on writing my thesis. But then when I came back to work, it was pretty intense. I think the nice thing is I talked to a lot of people who were in consulting. So I was prepared for the idea that these would be long hours, it'd be a difficult job. It's a whole new world, right? Like you're trying to learn a totally different skill set, including like Excel tricks, PowerPoint skills that I don't think PhDs are taught very well. But for me, it felt like a bit of an adventure, right? Like it was long hours, especially at the beginning when I was really learning to do everything. But you eventually find your own people, a lot like in the academic world where you sort of have a subset of people you spend a lot of time with. McKinsey is a huge firm. You can't do everything with everyone. And so you sort of find your little niche where you fit in. And I feel like that's what I've done here.
That's great to hear. I feel like a lot of people at Harvard and other institutions are starting to get more into doing consulting post-PhD. So I think our listeners are kind of very interested to hear how you got into it and how you kind of prepared for a career in consulting. And, a lot of times, we're being advertised like a lot of the skills you develop in the lab as a grad student can translate into like these kind of alternate careers. So we wanted to hear if you could tell us a little bit about how like the skills you develop in the lab, such as maybe like how you troubleshoot experiments, can translate it all to like the work you do in consulting.
Yeah, absolutely. So relating this back to my own PhD work, so I worked on a neglected tropical disease called Chagas disease. There are very few scientists who study this in the entire world. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of stuff that's just not known, right? We don't know about some of the genetic systems. We don't know why sometimes genes just kicked out when you add them in. There's all sorts of issues that you can't really explain. And so you just have to work with a certain level of uncertainty when you're starting out on a project. And it's your job to figure out what that uncertainty is and then solve it, right? And so I think that really prepared me well for consulting because a lot of what you do is, and for those who aren't familiar, I think maybe I'll start with a general overview of what a consultant actually is, right? So what we do, or at least what I do, is you are sort of a professional problem solver, right? So company has a problem, company wants to do XYZ, they have a goal, and you come in and you help them figure out how to do it, and then you help them execute on that. And so for me, what that looks like is for individual pharma companies, maybe there's a department that needs an overhaul. They've identified that they have an issue, or they feel like they're not meeting their goals, or they establish a really good goal and they're like, oh, we want to hit this. Then we come in and we say, oh, okay, so we see this is what you're trying to do. We break that problem down into smaller pieces, and then we go try to solve each piece individually to add up to the overarching thing, right? It's the same thing in the lab, right? So you know that you want to find out what proteins are present on the flagellum of Trypanosoma cruzi, right? And so what do you start with? Well, what proteins do we know are there, right? And you start to anchor off of those.
Yeah.
You use your techniques that you have to solve that problem. And so fundamentally, it's the exact same skill set. It's the problem solving, it's the critical thinking. And I think it's not a false advertisement at all to say that those are extremely applicable in the business world as well.
It's good to hear. And then guess you're going to do problem solving in any kind of field of consulting. I guess for our listeners, they would want to know, like, are you specifically in life science consulting and still doing stuff related to bio, or did you kind of transition to another area of consulting?
Yeah, technically my role is a generalist consultant, so I could consult on pretty much anything, right? And that includes things all the way from, environmental causes all the way to, I don't know, aerospace, right? But I don't know much about aerospace. I don't tend to specialize in that area. Instead, I really do focus in on the life sciences space. I find that that's the work that I find most rewarding. And I think that comes from, my background as a scientist all the way back to undergrad and high school, where I really just wanted to be involved in the more medical side of things.
Okay. It's cool to hear and learn a little bit more about, the different kind of work that consultants can do, since that's something as like a grad student kind of seems like a black box, until you get the chance to get the experience in consulting.
Yeah. But I guess there's definitely something really different from the academic and the PhD life, right? First, I can guess for consulting is very like time sensitive. There's no procrastination, right? And so any advice you can give the folks in graduate school, and I know who want to work in consulting. Yeah, I know a lot of people really like interest in the direction, but do you have any suggestions? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I would recommend. The first is just do what you do very well. So I think a lot of people are concerned that they're not doing enough different things in order to get into consulting, right? But the best preparation for consulting, because as I said, the fundamental skill set of consulting is problem solving and critical thinking. Those are the skills you learn during your PhD. And so if you do your PhD very well, you will develop those skills, right? And so I think that's an important piece to relieve you a little bit. Many of my friends have only their PhDs, did no extracurriculars, no internships, no clubs, and they still got the job as a consultant, right? And so it's because of that you can sort of drive that behavior. Now, that being said, I think if you want to get in to consulting and you know that, or you think that might be true, there are a few things you could do that are super helpful. The first is to set up coffee chats with people like myself. So Harvard has untold numbers of people who are now consultants or have previously been consultants, and you can always look them up on alumni databases. I'm happy to chat with people. Whoever may be interested in that should try to contact these people. A lot of times through LinkedIn is a great way to do it. Just send a message about, how you're connected, how, a little bit of information about what you're interested in. And that most people are honestly very happy to chat about this stuff. And so I think that's like the second most important thing you can do. And the third is to really explore, because I think consulting is a bit of a black box, right? Like you never know what it's like until you're actually doing it. And the reason for that is it's so unique and changing every single day. Some days I'm like on a plane to some other crazy place and I'm flying back same night. We did one workshop while I was there. I spent most of the day traveling, right? But other days I sit in my home office where I'm at right now and work on slides and hardly talk to anyone, right? So it's a different project every single day, and it really just depends on your interests and how you want to make your career. And so by exploring a wide variety of things while you're in graduate school, so things through the biotech club, like the one-on-one series, other things like that, you can get a sense for what you actually enjoy, or at least what you'd like to try out. And I think that's a great place to start. The last thing I would say would probably be internships. So internships are really, really great for developing your business skills, but also like giving you a sense of what it's like to work in a corporate environment. I would say it's very different than graduate school. And there's no way to explain it other than to experience it. So I think that that's something a lot of people have before graduate school. It's just a little bit of experience there, and it really helps you to understand and put into context the work you're doing for future applications, for future interviews, and it really helps you explain the impact of your work.
It's great to hear that advice, Maddie. I think it sounds like there's like no one direct path to, doing consulting. There's so many different paths. So it's good to hear, kind of there's different routes that people can take. And I think it's pretty interesting that like you had done an internship, but it was in like business development, like you were saying. So I was wondering, like from that experience and now in consulting, could you talk a little bit about how they differ, kind of your pros and cons of them, just so people kind of get an idea of like the different kind of careers that they could go into?
Yeah, for sure. So in business development, so I was an analyst for BioMarin. So first an intern, then an analyst. And that was a really great experience. I think the key point of business development is the strategic thinking in my mind. So there are a number of highly related careers, right? So there's like venture capital, business development, there's business development for the buy side, there's business development for the sell side. And so all of these are very highly related, which means all the skills are basically the same. But it's actually the day-to-day of what you do and the strategic thinking around it that differs, right? And so I would say that for me, business development was very fun because there was a big overarching strategy that we're trying to address, right? So for BioMarin, it's no secret. You're trying to address rare diseases, and you're trying to do so through curative therapies or life-changing therapies, right? So you want these to have really big effect. And so that's what we took with us every day. You say, okay, well, I'm going to look at 17 new technologies today through talking to different founders, through talking through different papers that I'm like reading on my own. And we're going to look at these and evaluate them in that context, right? And so if we think they could be helpful or could be useful, then we should move forward and learn more about them, right? And if we find one that's the perfect fit for the company, right? It works with the other therapies we're developing. It works with the other technologies we already have in-house. Then we should potentially try to license it or potentially try to sign an agreement with them so that we can co-develop it or something like that, right? And so when you have that sort of strategic thinking in mind, even if you saw the world's greatest cold medicine, right, you're probably not going to invest in it because that's not what you're strategically looking for. And I think that part of it is what differentiates it from like venture capital, where what you're trying to do is deploy capital into the best possible solutions. And that is a little bit of a different approach, right? Like you might look at much more broad swath of the world in terms of science. And so that's a great career path. It's a relatively small industry, right? So if we're the buy side, right? So where you're working for like a larger pharma company, the other side would be like the sell side, business development. And this is where you work for a smaller company and you actually facilitate interactions with the larger company. So the two business development groups meet and they sort of talk about the different technologies and things like that. So business development is very good, but it's a very different career than consulting, right? So there you have a very specific function. It's almost like one of the functions of a pharma company that really has a direct mission. Consulting, you're really more around individual projects, right? So I go from project to project. When I'm not on a project, life's great. I hang out. I do my little bit of work here and there, but it's not so bad. And then when you go to a project, you're really 100% dedicated to that project, right? So if I sign on to something, I will be, all of my emails, all of my meetings, everything will be dedicated to that project as an associate, which is very different and it requires a lot less of the project multitasking, but within a project, you're very involved. So typically you're driving an individual work stream. So you have a section of the overarching problem that you're dedicated to solving during that 8-week period, 10-week period, whatever it may be.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for telling us more about that. I think that's something people are weighing, the difference between consulting, VC, business development. So it's great to hear kind of the nitty gritty of like what people do in those different sectors.
Yeah, very informative. So actually, yeah, the questions you're talking about business development, and you have a lot of experience right now with case from different case. So in the future, do you see yourself working in consulting for the rest of the career, or could you see yourself in a role where they're going back to being more involved in maybe business development, even research? So, so what's your idea and thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's definitely a question I think about all the time. I really like consulting, and I think right now I'm very happy where I'm at, and I think, I'll probably stick around at least for a while. But that being said, always out, like the door's always open, and I'm always interested in alternative opportunities, new cool things that are going on. Because I think what drives me at work and what I'm most interested in is that strategic aspect of it, right? So I really enjoy strategic thinking regardless of the context, right? I don't necessarily love all the travel that we do in consulting, but I think it does enable us to do a lot of really cool projects that are very strategic, very focused on helping companies identify their next steps. And so because of that, I'm still very excited about it and interested. But I do also think that if we're talking about the rest of my career, anything could happen, and I could see any sort of strategy role. I will say I don't think I'll go back to the bench. I enjoyed it while I was in grad school, kind of, but I don't know that that's in the cards for the future.
Okay, it's really great to hear you're really liking working consulting. I think a lot of us from the outside here are kind of people that go into entry level positions of consulting. That a lot of these positions people stay for like a year or two before moving into something else. Is that something that's like very prevalent or less common? And a lot of people like yourself are staying in these roles for long term. Like, could you comment on that frequency?
Yeah, I think a lot of people go into consulting as a sort of way to move on to the next thing, right? So they come to consulting, they learn a lot in those first couple of years, and then they move on to their future career, typically at like the same kind of companies that hire us, right? And so that's actually great for everyone, right? Because the you don't need as many partners as you need associates, right? So we can't keep everybody. But I think that coming to a consulting firm, any of the consulting firms, you have a lot of exposure early on in your career to a lot of different ways of doing things, right? And that helps you catapult your career to the next level. And I think for anyone coming out of a PhD, it could make a lot of sense to do consulting for a few years and then exit into something else where you find that you really are interested, right? Because you can try out all these different things while you're a consultant. And I would say, yeah, it's extremely common, right? Like there's quite a bit of turnover in the consulting industry, and I think that's just part of the game, right? Like I think these companies are well aware of that, and they make sure that they have enough hiring going on all the time that they take care of that.
Okay, that's great to hear. And yeah, just like with any industry, there's always turnover. So it's good to hear that like, there is a good hierarchy for people to like move on to within consulting, to move on from
Venture capital.
Yeah, to move on from being an associate, or if they have all these connections to other industries, they can move on to those industries, if they don't like to do consulting. So yeah, thanks so much for telling us more about that.
Maddie, we now a little step back. Actually, a question we're curious about that. Can you share with us a defining moment during your time in graduate school, and what was your proudest moment and accomplishment?
All right, 3 things. I'll tell you my proudest accomplishment because this one is ridiculous. It's kind of like a humble brag, so I apologize for this in advance. But so when I defended my PhD, I had 2 papers that I was working on to complete. And my first paper went in and got accepted. Everything was great before graduation. And then the day I defended my thesis, during my defense, like my actual defense with the private committee, my second paper was accepted like at that moment. So it was quite cool to have it like all close on the exact same day. It was quite fun. But so that was my proudest accomplishment. I would say defining moment. Honestly, I think the day I decided to take on that incubator and director role, I think was a huge defining moment for me. It's for one thing to be like a participant in a program like that, where you're sort of saying, okay, yeah, I'll come, I'll do the homework, all these different things, and you learn a lot. But I think you take it to the next level when you really become a member of the leadership. And that meant not only becoming a leadership member for the incubator, but also for the biotech club. And that really helped me to sort of establish a group of friends at Harvard to really push forward my own career, to push forward my ability to talk to people who are much more senior than myself. I met Peter Konczynski that way, all these different people who I would never have had the opportunity to meet or talk to if I had just stayed at the participant level. And so I think that was probably the real turning point in my career.
Yeah, it's really great to hear. And we definitely agree as current members of the club about all like the connections and people you meet that are really valuable. So yeah, thanks for telling us more about that. And another thing we wanted to ask, now that I'm thinking about it, is like you had done your graduate school in Boston and you're working at McKinsey now in San Francisco right now. Is that correct? So
Yeah.
those are like, cool. So that's like the other kind of biotech hub in the US, on the West Coast. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how, they compare like biotech in Boston compared to San Francisco.
Well, I haven't been here too long, so I would say I'm not necessarily the best person to comment on that. But I would definitely say tech has a much bigger influence on this. So I think you see a lot more of the tech bio side of things. I do think there's quite a higher concentration in Boston, so you end up, it also doesn't help that I was associated with Harvard at the time, so everybody is either biotech or Harvard, so it really adds up. But I would say the industry is really thriving in both places, and so it's always exciting to see new companies coming up, new ideas floated around, and I think there's a lot of excitement here in San Francisco, and I haven't been back to Boston in a while, but my understanding is it continues.
Yeah, it's still great here, but yeah, I imagine it's huge value actually, and like being on like the East Coast and the West Coast now too. I imagine your network now is kind of expanded since, in Boston, it's such a small world where you interact with the same people. I imagine meeting new people has been really valuable as well now in your career.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's a bit of a challenge when you change coasts, right? Because we had always sort of established networks on the East Coast and across the East Coast kind of. You get the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia area as well. But changing coasts really does change your network. And so I highly recommend if you're in grad school and you have reason to come to San Francisco, build your network a little bit, meet up with a couple of people, because I think it can be tough to do when you move here, or it takes a lot of dedication and time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And I think, I definitely hear that from a lot of people. It's like obviously a big biotech hub in San Francisco. And then also people that get tired of the weather in Boston, will leave at any time to go somewhere with much better weather. So I think that's another thing that's great with San Francisco that'll get a lot of people to go.
Yeah.
There are a lot of outdoor mixers here, which you could never do in Boston. So
yeah, at least not now.
Yes, for sure.
So also work. So Maddie, tell us about your hobbies. Do you still have a work-life balance? Yeah.
Yeah, so hobbies. So we just adopted 2 kittens from a shelter here in SF. Actually, it was in Oakland, but their names are Menno and Poppy. So they're very, very cute, but they take up quite a bit of time because they're only 5 months old. So they love to be played with, do all these things. But I would say my husband Harry and I are getting into hiking quite a bit here in San Francisco. As you guys know, the access to nature is just unparalleled. But then other than that, huge fan of restaurants, huge fan of like city events, things like that. I'm always down to go try new things. And San Francisco is a great food city.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, especially I know you talked about how busy consulting is and everything. So it's good for people considering that to know like they'll have a life outside of consulting. There's time to do other things. And yeah, I'm sure people...
actually, Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, you go ahead, Maddie.
Oh, I was just gonna say, actually, one good piece to put in on that I think is good for people to know is that although you're very, very busy during the week, weekends are generally protected. So I can tell you the number of hours I've worked on the weekend. I think is maybe like 3 total. And in all the time that I've worked for McKinsey, so they do a pretty good job of making sure that that's definitely true, and it really enables a lot of like fun things that you couldn't necessarily do in graduate school when you have to go take care of your parasites every week.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. I think people in grad school are so used to working on weekends, especially if they're working with cells or mice, for instance. So I think like, we have the flexibility like during the week potentially, even though there's long hours then. But it's good to hear that like, weekends are free, since that's something that is kind of very foreign for a lot of grad students, postdocs, a lot of scientists.
Okay.
Cool. So yeah, and that's it for our questions that we have. But yeah, thank you so much, Maddie.
Thank you so much.
Taking time out of your the week. I know it's like still probably your work day now in San Francisco. So thank you so much for fitting us in with all these meetings, and really appreciating getting to hear back from one of our former co-presidents. It's always great to hear what are people doing after being part of the club and being part of Harvard.
Of course. And thank you so much for taking the time to interview me. And hopefully lots of people get to hear about consulting and give me a call. Happy to chat.
Yeah, I'm sure people will reach out. Consulting is very popular, and I think you give a lot of great advice. So I'm sure people are going to want to hear more.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, that's the end of this episode for the Harvard Biotech Club podcast. I want to thank Feng for helping co-host and producing this episode. And I want to thank everyone for listening, and please stay tuned for the next episode.